Story 1. The apartment felt suffocatingly quiet as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one stretching into eternity in the stillness of the night. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, the words blurring together as my mind wandered. Then, like a sudden crack of thunder in the silence, the phone rang. Its shrill sound cut through the air, jolting me from my thoughts. Heart pounding, I stumbled to my feet and made my way to the phone, its incessant ringing filling the room. With trembling hands, I lifted the receiver, a sense of unease creeping over me. "Hello?" I said tentatively, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence greeted me from the other end of the line. No dial tone, no background noise, just an eerie void that sent shivers down my spine. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice quivering with uncertainty. Still, there was no response. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breaths coming in shallow gasps as I waited for some sign of life on the other end of the line. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy blanket of stillness that seemed to smother the room. I replaced the receiver slowly, my mind racing with questions. Wrong number? Prank call? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that lingered in the air, but it clung to me like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. With a nervous glance over my shoulder, I returned to the comfort of my book, trying to lose myself in its pages. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent a chill down my spine. Hours passed, the darkness outside deepening into the early hours of the morning. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But then, just as I was beginning to drift off to sleep, the phone rang again. This time, I hesitated before answering, a sense of dread pulling in the pit of my stomach. With trembling fingers, I lifted the receiver once more. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And once again, silence greeted me from the other end of the line. No sound, no response, just the oppressive weight of nothing. I could feel panic rising within me, threatening to consume me whole. Who was calling me in the dead of night, only to remain silent on the other end of the line? I considered hanging up, ending the call and retreating back into the safety of my bed. But something held me back, a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I waited, listening intently for any sign of life on the other end of the line. But there was nothing, just the hollow echo of my own breathing filling the silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. I sat there in stunned silence, the phone still clutched in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Tell someone? Or was I overreacting, letting my imagination run wild in the darkness of the night? But before I could make a decision, the phone rang again. And again. And again. Each time, the same eerie silence greeted me from the other end of the line, a silent reminder that I was not alone. I felt trapped by the relentless ringing of the phone, the suffocating silence that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. I tried to block it out, to convince myself that it was just a prank, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the ringing stopped for good. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy weight pressing down on me from all sides. I sat there in the darkness, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from the ordeal. And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, I knew that I would never forget the silent caller who had haunted my dreams. Story 2. The old Victorian house stood at the end of the street like a silent sentinel, its weathered facade bearing the scars of time. I moved in alone, eager to start a new chapter of my life in this quaint little town. The house was a fixer-upper, but I relished the opportunity to make it my own. Little did I know, the house had other plans for me. The whispers started almost immediately, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves on a quiet night. At first, I dismissed them as the sounds of an old house settling, the echoes of its past inhabitants lingering in the air. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. I tried to rationalize them away, attributing them to the wind or the creaking of floorboards, but deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. It was as if the very walls of the house were alive, murmuring secrets that I could never hope to understand. Nighttime was the worst. As I lay in bed, trying to sleep, the whispers would crescendo into a cacophony of voices, their words swirling together in a twisted symphony of madness. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their presence filled me with an unshakable dread. I began to avoid certain parts of the house, the places where the whispers seemed to emanate from the strongest. The attic, with its dusty relics of the past, became off-limits, as did the basement, with its cold, damp corridors. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the relentless whispers that haunted my every waking moment. Desperate for answers, I turned to the history of the house, hoping to uncover the source of the whispers that seemed to permeate its very foundation. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had a dark and troubled past, marked by tragedy and death. Over the years, it had been home to countless families, each one leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and despair. There were stories of suicides and murders, of restless spirits doomed to wander its halls for eternity. I tried to ignore the stories, to convince myself that they were nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house was haunted, and I was its latest victim. As the days passed, the whispers grew more ominous, their words taking on a sinister edge that sent shivers down my spine. I became convinced that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move from the shadows. One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house once and for all. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of dread, I ventured into the darkest corners of the attic, where the whispers seemed to be the strongest. The air was thick with dust and decay as I made my way through the cluttered space, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, suddenly, I saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows, a shapeless figure lurking in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the figure drew closer, its form shifting and contorting with each step. And then, to my horror, it spoke, a voice with hatred. "You should not have come here," it whispered, its words echoing through the silence. "This house belongs to us now. You are not welcome here." With a cry of terror, I turned and fled, the echoes of the creature's words ringing in my ears. I stumbled down the stairs, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating shroud, until at last, I burst through the front door and into the cool night air. I never looked back as I fled from that accursed house, leaving behind the whispers that still haunt my dreams to this day. Story 3. The rhythmic sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls of my apartment, each sound sending shivers down my spine. It began innocently enough, a faint tapping against the hardwood floors when I was certain I was alone. At first, I chalked it up to the settling of an old building or the wind playing tricks on my ears. But as the nights wore on, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, impossible to ignore. I lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, its walls adorned with memories of a life once lived. But now, those walls felt like barriers, trapping me in a nightmare of my own making. The first time I heard them, I was sitting in my living room, bathed in the soft glow of the television. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like the distant patter of rain against a window pane. But as I strained to listen, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right outside my door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as the footsteps moved through the hallway with intent. Each step seemed to reverberate through the walls, sending vibrations coursing through my very being. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear held me captive, rooted to the spot as the unseen intruder approached. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps ceased, leaving behind a deafening silence that seemed to swallow me whole. I waited, breath held in anticipation, but nothing came. With trembling hands, I mustered the courage to investigate, but the hallway was empty, the only trace of the intruder the lingering echo of their presence. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the silence, dreading the inevitable return of those phantom footsteps. But they never came, and I dared to hope that perhaps it had all been a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by loneliness and paranoia. But the following night, they returned with a vengeance, louder and more insistent than before. This time, I was ready. I armed myself with a flashlight and a sense of determination, determined to confront whatever lurked in the darkness of my home. As the first echoes of footsteps reached my ears, I sprang into action, racing through the apartment. But no matter how hard I searched, I found no trace of the intruder, no hint of their presence save for the fading echoes that seemed to mock me from the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and still, the footsteps persisted, a relentless reminder of the terror that lurked just beyond the edges of my perception. I tried everything to rid myself of their haunting presence, sage smudging, salt circles, even calling in a priest to bless the apartment, but nothing worked. The footsteps remained, growing louder and more pronounced with each passing night. I became a prisoner in my own home, barricading myself in my room each night, hoping against hope that the footsteps would leave me in peace. But they followed me, their relentless cadence echoing through the walls like a drumbeat of impending doom. I began to lose sleep, my mind unraveling under the constant strain of fear and exhaustion. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, whispering secrets too terrible to comprehend. I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness, their gaze cold and unyielding. One night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of grim determination, I ventured into the heart of the darkness, determined to uncover the truth. The apartment was silent as I crept through its empty halls, the only sound the steady thud of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. But as I reached the end of the hallway, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness beyond. Heart pounding in my chest, I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the shadows like a beacon of hope in the night. And then, suddenly, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, its form shrouded in darkness. For a moment, I hesitated, fear coursing through my veins like ice water. But then, with a resolve born of desperation, I called out into the darkness, demanding to know who or what lurked in the shadows. And then, as if in response, the figure began to move, its movements slow and deliberate as it advanced towards me. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized the truth. The footsteps were not those of an intruder, but of something far more sinister, something that had been lurking in the darkness all along. As the figure drew closer, I could see its features more clearly, twisted and contorted into a grotesque parody of humanity. And then, with a shock that left me reeling, I realized that the figure was no stranger, it was me. I stumbled back in horror, my mind unable to comprehend the truth of what I was seeing. But even as I tried to flee, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to escape the clutches of my own twisted reflection. Story 4. The old Victorian house stood imposingly at the end of the street, its weathered facade shrouded in mystery. It was the kind of place that whispered secrets, each creak of its floorboards echoing with the weight of its history. When I moved in, I was captivated by its charm, unaware of the horrors that lurked within its walls. As I settled into my new home, I couldn't help but notice the mirrors that adorned nearly every room. They were relics from another era, their ornate frames reflecting the grandeur of the house. At first, I found them enchanting, but soon, they became portals to something far more sinister. It started innocently enough, a fleeting movement in the reflection, a shadow that seemed to linger just beyond the glass. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, the product of late nights spent exploring the corridors of the house. But as the days turned into weeks, the reflections grew more ominous, their distortions more pronounced. One evening, as I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, I saw it. A figure, hazy and indistinct, standing just behind me. My heart thundered in my chest as I whirled around, but there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that settled over me like a suffocating blanket, but the image haunted me long after I turned away. Night after night, the mirrors became windows to a world beyond my understanding. Faces twisted in agony, shadows that moved of their own accord, each reflection more terrifying than the last. I covered the mirrors, desperate to escape their gaze, but still, they followed me, their presence noticeable even in the darkest corners of the house. It wasn't until one fateful night that I realized the true nature of the mirrors. I had awoken to the sound of whispers, faint and indistinct, echoing through the empty halls. As I stumbled out of bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror across the room. I froze, my blood turning to ice as I watched the reflection of the figure standing just behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words filled the room. I tried to block them out, to rationalize them away, but they consumed me, suffocating me with their presence. In a fit of panic, I tore the covers off the nearest mirror, expecting to find some trick of the light or a hidden speaker. But what I saw chilled me to the bone. The figure in the reflection stared back at me with empty eyes, its twisted features contorted in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with terror. This wasn't just a trick of the light, it was something far more sinister. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the figure reached out from the mirror, its hands stretching impossibly through the glass. I fled, my heart racing as I raced through the darkened corridors of the house. But no matter where I turned, the figures in the mirrors followed me, their silent screams echoing in my ears. I barricaded myself in my room, hoping to escape their gaze, but even there, I couldn't find peace. For days, I lived in a state of constant fear, the whispers of the mirrors haunting my every waking moment. I tried to leave, to escape the horrors that lurked within the house, but something held me back, a force beyond my comprehension. In the end, I was forced to confront the truth. The mirrors were not just reflections of the world around me, but gateways to a realm of unimaginable horror. And as long as I remained within the confines of that accursed house, there was no escape from the terror that awaited me on the other side. Story 5. The house, an old Victorian relic tucked away on the edge of town, had always held a certain allure for me. Its grandeur now stood as a testament to time's unrelenting march. But despite its faded elegance, I was drawn to it, captivated by its mysterious charm. As I moved in, excitement mingled with a tinge of apprehension. The rooms echoed with the whispers of old days, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the house's long history. Yet, amidst the nostalgia, there was something else I noticed, a presence that seemed to linger just beyond the edge of perception. It began innocently enough, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a whisper of breath against my neck. At first, I dismissed it as an overactive imagination, the inevitable side effect of living alone in a house so steeped in history. But as the days turned into weeks, the presence grew more tangible, more sinister. Every night, as I sat in the dim glow of my living room, I felt its eyes upon me, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. One evening, as I sat on the threadbare sofa, engrossed in a book, I saw it. A shadow, dark and amorphous, lurking in the corner of the room. My heart skipped a beat as I watched it slither across the floor, its form shifting and undulating like smoke caught in a gentle breeze. Frozen in terror, I could do nothing but watch as it drew closer, its presence suffocating. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear held me captive in its grasp, making me powerless against the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the night. I sat there for a while, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in gasps. From that night on, I never felt truly alone in my own home again. The shadow became a constant presence, lurking in the corners of every room, its gaze following me wherever I went. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the house's eerie atmosphere. But deep down, I knew the truth. I sought solace in the daylight, dreading the inevitable nightfall, when the shadows would once again come alive. I avoided the rooms where the presence was strongest, the air heavy with an oppressive sense of dread. But no matter where I went, I could never escape the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something beyond my comprehension. I considered leaving, abandoning the house and all its secrets to the mercy of time. But something held me back, a curiosity born of fear and fascination. I needed to know what lurked within the shadows, what dark force held sway over my home. Armed with nothing but determination and a sense of doom, I delved into the house's history, scouring old newspapers and dusty archives for any clue that might shed light on the mystery that had consumed my life. But the more I searched, the more elusive the truth became, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. And then, one fateful night, as I sat alone in the darkness, the shadow returned. But this time, it brought with it a voice, a whisper so faint it was barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Leave this place," it hissed. "Leave before it's too late." I wanted to heed its warning, to flee from the nightmare that had become my reality. But something held me back, a stubbornness born of desperation and despair. I couldn't leave, not until I had unraveled the mystery that had consumed my life. And so, I remained, trapped in a house haunted by shadows and echoes of the past. I never found the answers I sought, never uncovered the truth behind the darkness that had consumed my home. But in the end, it didn't matter. And as I sit here, alone in the darkness, I can only wonder what horrors lie in wait for those who dare to seek the truth in the shadows.